Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome back, Dr. Orzsag. Since Congress has become under Democrat control, they have recently achieved a trifecta of trillions. We have a $1 trillion government stimulus bill that includes a fleet of cars for government employees, more money for the National Endowment for Arts, more subsidies to Amtrak. Then we had about 2 weeks later, less than 2 weeks later, a $1 trillion appropriations bill, first time in our nation's history, complete with thousands of pork barrel projects, including lobster research protection for mouse habitat. Now we have a $1 trillion budget deficit to boot. On top of that now, we have the Democrat administration proposing a budget with red ink as far as the eye can see. Two questions, Dr. Orzsag, to make sure I have my facts right. At 27% of GDP, would this be the largest peacetime budget in our nation's history?
The budget that we are inheriting, yes, for peacetime, that's
Well, I'm
correct.
sorry, are you inheriting the budget or are you proposing this budget?
The 27% is for a year in which we are in the midst of a severe recession and includes the steps that have been necessary to address the downturn.
Well, I'm just looking for a simple, so the answer is
Yes.
yes. Thank you. Also, with this budget, would this double the national debt in 8 years? Is that true?
Under current policies, the debt increase would be even larger. We reduce the deficits, but there still is a
But
significant
is it
increase
true
in debt.
that in 8 years that the debt would be doubled under this budget?
Yes, but again, the debt increase is less than if we fail to act.
Can I ask one?
I'd be happy to yield.
Is
to
that
the
if you
ranking
include
member.
the surge last for 10 years?
That is if you include the traditional way of doing
Okay, thank you.
baselines, yes.
You said earlier in your testimony that you wanted to avoid the mistakes of the past. Let me read you a quote from one of our former Secretary of Treasury's. Quote, "We are spending more than we have ever spent before, and it does not work. We have never made good on our promises, and after 8 years of this administration, we have just as much unemployment as when we started and an enormous debt to boot." You probably recognize the quote. It was President Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, and that quote was given in 1939. I have no doubt, Dr. Orzsag, that you have also studied carefully the lessons of Japan that had a similar real estate bubble that burst, and I'm sure you have studied their lost decade. Recently, the New York Times, not exactly a bastion of conservative thought, wrote about the experience, where it talks about Japan accumulated the largest public debt in the developed world while failing to generate a convincing recovery. This is coming from the New York Times. Quote, "This has led many to conclude that spending did little more than sink Japan deeply into debt, leaving an enormous tax burden for future generations. Among ordinary Japanese, the spending is widely disparaged for having turned this nation into a public works-based welfare state and making regional economies dependent on Tokyo for jobs," unquote. My question is, given our own history, given the Japanese history, what historical precedent is the administration basing this budget on in its belief that they can borrow and spend our way into national prosperity?
Well, let me take the Japanese example. I think the lesson from the Japanese example is that the failure to deal aggressively and upfront with problems in the financial system ultimately proved to be a big mistake in which the lost decade occurred. I'm going to defer to Secretary Geithner and the other members of the administration's economics team in terms of how to address problems in the financial markets, but I know that they are motivated by a desire to avoid that mistake. So I think the key to avoiding that outcome is to get at the nub of the problem that occurred in Japan, which was a sort of rope-a-dope strategy on the banking and financial market problems.
Okay. Let's move on to taxes in the limited time I have left. Is it not true that under this budget we are looking at a $636 billion tax increase that would be a tax on carbon-based energy used by almost everyone in our nation, and a tax on small businesses, since the overwhelming majority of small businesses pay tax at the top two individual rates? And if so, how is this going to help the family budget? How is it going to help create jobs?
Let's talk about small businesses. The the budget proposes some tax changes starting in 2011 that will affect the top 3% of small business owners. The rest will not be affected, and in fact, many of them will receive a net tax cut through other provisions in the budget, including a 0% capital gains rate on qualified stock owned in small businesses. But I think more important than any of that, the problem facing most small businesses today is the lack of economic activity and the lack of access to credit. So the most important thing we could do to get small businesses back on their feet is get the economy moving again and get credit flowing. The budget includes $28 billion in loan guarantees to help small businesses, including through the so-called 7A program that's been very effective in the past. I think that is the key to getting them back on their feet.